Keys to the dentist who just totally wear these. Keys to the dentist who just totally wear these.
Okay, so you guys are.
We don't have to.
No, yeah.
Where are we? Yeah, we're I walk around a lot, so that's why I do get it.
It's,
Okay.
it's good in some ways.
Testing. Is this loud enough, too loud?
Very perfect.
Can you hear me too?
I can. And I have a somewhat bad left ear, so it's good.
I have somewhat bad.
Okay. As we get started, this isn't on our slides, we were just curious, how many people in the room are faculty?
You're 7 minutes early, actually.
Yeah, I know, I'm just curious about people.
Oh, we're having a warm-up session.
Yeah. This is something that I saw at the tech show that I liked.
Could you be more explicit about what you mean by on the faculty? Like primarily on the faculty?
Yes. Are you not a librarian? Are you considered by the categories in your school to be faculty? How many people are tech staff? Okay, how many people are librarians? Okay, good. And just informally, before we get started, does anybody have specific questions about what we saw at the ABA Tech Show they'd really like to have us address in the session? Everything, okay.
I agree, because I wanted to go and didn't make it.
Okay, well, one of the things we're going to do is try to get our notes from the sessions that will be more detailed than what we can cover right now into a Google Docs folder so that you guys can go look at those in more detail if you hear about something and just kind of glossing over it.
So in general, yes. Yeah.
We've always gone to the expo because we're in Chicago and it's free. But this was the first year we've attended the sessions and we got a lot out of it, so that's why we're doing this. Anybody else have any specific questions besides everything that you'd like to hear? Any questions about what the ABA Tech Show is?
Can you hear me still? Can you hear me? Excellent. All right.
Check 1, 2.
Okay, yes, everyone can still hear me? Awesome. Yes. We'll still wait.
These live tech shows are doomed.
This is a little more often.
I would have lived in last time, like stand behind a desk in a presentation or something. So I'm hoping this that the camera covers more. Okay, so I got that thing. Forward.
So you want to put the desk on?
Yes. Oh, so the camera really does have a good angle. Oh, I love this.
Okay, for people who just entered the room, we were asking before we start, does anybody have really specific questions of things they've heard happened at the ABA Tech Show or just wondering about the ABA Tech Show? Okay.
That's all the last half of the question. So, out them Dune walleye ones. Or the cubs, those are really good. The evil looks from Cub Fam.
Yeah, the only person here who's Blackhawks fan came from over there.
No, I'm sure it's like, no?
That's okay.
Okay.
Anyone like hockey?
There we go. We've got one Chicago Bears staff.
I'm a Floridian and I'm like talking hockey here.
You have to wait till time. Nobody's waiting, people coming in, enjoying hummus, which is not carrots, but it's not a cupcake either. When you're all like, I'm gonna go get a cupcake now. It's not hummus at all.
I thought we were fancy cupcake.
Because Sarah had set us up for the cupcakes, you know, to bring the whole cupcake truck here. We got a cupcake from the cupcake truck. Yay! What kind of cupcake?
Yeah, I got one pizza with ones, and then I've got two more to take home with chocolate and a black and white.
Sounds good. Those are good. One of our librarians actually made an entire list of Chicago food trucks. So if you want to know, like, food trucks stopping by when, the list is a quick Twitter list. 3:30, you ready? You ready? Yep. All right, who wants to tech show? We want to tech show. So, Emily, want to start?
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm the Technology Development and Training Librarian at Chicago Tech. So Debbie and I work together in the Library Technology Group. We do a lot of support for technology and training, and we always want to bring back new and exciting things to faculty and staff in various departments because we like to collaborate with a lot of different people.
I'm Elizabeth Farrell. I'm the Associate Director at Florida State University College of Law in Tallahassee, and basically I work in protection for the exact same reason.
All right, my name is Debbie Ginsberg. I'm the Educational Technology Librarian, and one of my main jobs is to tell the faculty, hey, what's new in the world of legal technology? And this is one of the easiest and best places to find out. And of course, it's local, and it's right here. So we're all really excited to go to the technology show and learn to use technology. Am I too far away from here? Yeah, hold on. So we all went to the ABA Tech Show, and it's in Chicago, it's in April, and so over the course of a few days. One of the things you may not know is there's often ways to get discounts. So when you go to the ABA Tech Show and you're thinking of, oh my God, how am I going to afford to pay this? Because they're assuming that lawyers who get lawyer salaries are going to go, and you see that it costs something like close to $1,000 or something if you're just going as a lawyer, and if you're not, particularly if you're not a member of the ABA, it seems cost prohibitive. But we found there's different ways to get discounts. For example, the Chicago Association of Law Libraries was able to negotiate a discount on behalf of all of its members to pay the paralegal rate. Still, the cheapest, but much cheaper than the original rate. And we were also told that there can be other discounts arranged depending on who you talk to. So, we did want to see if anyone had any questions that we've been asking at the beginning.
Questions, anyone?
things that you might like, you came to the session, like, this is the one thing I want to get out of the session. The reason I came to the session is you trust us. So shall we tell you a little bit about what the Tech Show is and who has been doing this, or who goes? And obviously, mostly it is practicing lawyers who go, practicing lawyers who are interested, practicing with technology. But since they have a paralegal rate, obviously they're interested. Sometimes we see law firm librarians. We see fewer academics go because it is so practitioner oriented. And many vendors who sell these services to attorneys will be there as well. And students, there's special student rates, so students are encouraged to go as well. We came across quite a few of those. The Tech Show has been in existence since 1986, so it's been going for quite some time. The great thing about the Tech Show is there's two parts to it. There's one part that Emily and I have been going to for years, and that is the exhibit hall. The exhibit hall is free to anyone who goes. And you can really get a sense of the different kinds of technologies available just by wandering the exhibit hall. And Elizabeth, you're going to talk more about what you saw there later. The other part is panels, and for a while we hadn't gone to the panels because you have to pay for that, but this year we were able to go and see the different panels. And the panels cover all kinds of technologies. Some of them are practical, how to get the most out of your operating system, different technologies that people like to use on their iPads. Some of them discuss more of the latest issues in law and technology. So we'll be talking about issues of social media law and technology, or other things are how law is using technology to practice. So we'll also be talking about ideas like predictive coding. We'll tell you more about what that means further on. But these are the kinds of things that you can find at the ABA Tech Show. Okay. So first thing we'll talk about is exhibit hall.
Yeah. Okay, so like Debbie said, the exhibit hall alone is really well worth going for on its own, if that's all you can do. It's, for those of you who have been to other shows, even like AAAL, and you go, oh, that's a big exhibit hall. There's even more vendors at the ABA Tech Show that are really, really worth sort of seeing, because they're not vendors that you would necessarily see in other places. You can learn a lot. And of course, there's always swag, if that's your thing. The vendors are doing a lot of that kind of stuff. But sort of some of the categories of stuff that you see: practice management, e-discovery, dictation, trial presentation, security storage, web meetings, even things that are more practice-oriented, sort of on the operations side, things like virtual secretarial or reception services, or even outsourced IT support. A lot of things. So I want to kind of discuss a couple sort of hot, of the many, many vendors there, some of the ones that might be of particular interest to this crowd, whether you're supporting clinics or just want to expose your students to law practice tech. Sort of going through a few categories. First, cloud, sort of e-discovery, that category of things. You have practice management software. I know is not something that's necessarily new to clinics, but I know some clinics don't use it because in the past it's required some installation, security concerns. But now a lot of it is on the cloud. One, in fact, Clio, who is here as a sponsor, they do a lot of work with clinics. And something that should be said too, a lot of these vendors, they may have educational programs for those of you in law schools, where they have either free or reduced access. Some of them don't, but they've just never been asked. And when I've asked vendors, hey, oh, do you have an academic program? They go, no, but let's talk. So the sort of my big takeaway was from the ABA Tech Show was ask. Ask for, hey, can we do this? Can we get a trial or do something like that? But cloud practice, so we have Clio, that's one of the big ones. Others in the sort of cloud-based practice management category, MyCase, Rocket Matter, those are all ones. And by the way, all the vendors I'm going to mention, they're going to be available in the presenter notes, so you shouldn't have to sort of jot these all down super quickly. Another thing in the sort of cloud category, there's a lot of e-discovery tools out there now that are made for, they're cloud-based. You can upload giant document sets, which I think would be really cool for a simulation in a class. Tools, one's called Logical, Clustify, those are cloud e-discovery vendors. Then on to sort of the next category of things, I'd say just sort of in the paperless realm of things, operations and functions that are going paperless. First, sort of creating documents. What some of you, any of you heard of Hot Docs as for document creation? Yeah, Hot Docs is a well-known one. But there's other ones. Smokeball, I think they're out of Australia. They're coming into the U.S. legal market. Another one called Logic, and they've done some really cool sort of automated form stuff for, I think they started in Florida and maybe Illinois, and they're branching into other states as well. Another cool tool in sort of the paperless realm is apps and tools for doing depositions paperlessly. Agile Law, eDepose, those are some really cool deposition tools and deposition apps that might just run on your iPad. Okay, on to the next category, sort of under the trial, tech, litigation, miscellaneous things. There's a really cool amount of things. This is real sort of general miscellaneous category. And if you do any kind of trial advocacy, anything like this, there's some really interesting things. TrialPad, that's an iPad app. Sanction, that's been around for a while. Two timeline tools, Intrepid TimeStream, VDocs Timeline for creating timelines, very pretty visual tools, Exhibit View, and a few other ones, just sort of throwing this in there in a random category of cool things we saw, cool vendors. One was Transporter, which I think that was a Kickstarter thing, but they're basically a Dropbox, but a private Dropbox. You actually have your own little hard drive. Zoom.us, which is a really cool kind of quasi-Google Hangout, but it can accommodate up to 25 people. And then also a tool called WordRake, which I was really excited to see. It's a plugin for Word, specifically for legal drafting, and I have my eyes all over that for possible legal writing classes. Some really interesting things. So who can use this stuff? Like I've mentioned, clinics, but really anything related to practice. If you're just sort of wanting to expose your students to this stuff, or bring it into law practice management classes or trial ad classes, there's really no limit to what you can do. And since there are a lot of cloud-based things, you can do them with limited IT support or involvement. So if you just want to sort of jump in and do this with your class, it's not, for most of these, they aren't necessarily going to require a huge investment of IT time and resources. So, and like I said, how you get access, ask. This is the one great thing about going to these kinds of shows versus just sort of calling up a vendor, because sometimes you call and you might not get the right person. These people, the reps that are at these trade shows like the ABA Tech Show, they're there to build business, and if you say, hey, I want this, you'll end up with a voicemail box of like 20 messages when you get back with, hey, this is so-and-so following up. So yeah, ask, get in contact. This is a great way to build those connections and bring back some cool stuff for your school.
You'd be surprised some of the things that we find out. For example, Sanction had been a standalone trial presentation software for a long time. Recently it's been bought by Lexis, which means it's free to law schools. So these are the kinds of things that we find out at the ABA Tech Show. If you're following it, sometimes you know this a long time, but for me it's like, hey, that's news, and it gives me something else to find out, play with, not playing with Sanction, to see how it might be used in court or in classrooms or in other ways. Again, this year I got to attend a lot of sessions, and unsurprisingly, if you've seen some of the ABA stats, I think the ones I mentioned in my iPad presentation last year was like a third penetration of third lawyers were using iPads already. It's got to be higher this year. I haven't seen the numbers this year, but definitely the lawyers presenting at this year's ABA Tech Show showed a lot of love for their iPads and iPhones, and there were presentations just on some of their favorite apps. And it won't surprise you if you've been using iOS for a long time, what their favorite apps are. Dropbox, they love Dropbox. Now you may think, hey, Dropbox, is that secure enough to be used for law? And some of them will just use it, but some of them discussed ways to add security to Dropbox using other forces like Box Secure. They, of course, like to write on their iPads. Their iPads are more than just reading devices. So they'll use different apps like Quick Office or Docs to Go to do that. They're still not the perfect Word replacement. I keep hearing that eventually Word's going to come to the iPad. It was supposed to be in March at one point, and now I guess it's pushed off to the fall if it's coming at all.
They just announced it.
Oh, they did?
Yeah,
I missed that.
today.
Today? Finally.
Yeah.
What did they announce? This is why I love this place.
iOS, Office for iOS. I haven't looked at it yet, but they
You have to be subscribed to the Office 365.
Yeah, that's it.
Interesting. Okay, so finally, you can't even keep up with these rumors because they change on a dime. So today, finally, we're going to have some really happy lawyers. a lot of lawyers like, of course, to take notes, and they like the notes to be available anywhere. So they use Evernote. It's one of the most popular ones. Who here is an Evernote user? So I don't have to convert you to know that you just take your notes in Evernote, and it's available on your iPad and on your iPhone and on your desktop. One of the interesting ways I've seen it is some of them are using Evernote to organize their documents for trial. So they can go into trial with all those great Evernote, searchable Evernote folders. Evernote, of course, you can take pictures of documents, you can OCR it. Great tools for lawyers, they love it. They love apps that do dictation. And of course, if you have a newer iPad, iPhone, then of course the dictation's built in. If not, you might want to use the Dropbox or the dragging dictation app, not as good. And they use it for presentations, so a lot of them talked about how they were using Keynote, even Keynote on the iPad, to create presentations for trial. So the Keynote is not just something you're going to use for classroom, not just something you use for a presentation like this, but they'll use it at trial. And finally, of course, they like organizing their different PDFs. So again, there's PDF Annotate, there's iAnnotate, but Goodreader, which is my favorite, got a lot of love. I like Goodreader because it doesn't just open PDFs, you can open up other kinds of documents. You can annotate your PDFs, and you can pull your PDFs from multiple sources like the cloud. So these are the, they may seem like very typical apps, but these are the apps that the lawyers are very excited about. Other apps that they're excited about, they do some mind mapping. So a lot of them mentioned iThoughts. That's my favorite mind mapper. But they're also very excited about different ways to do presentation technologies. And I was surprised to see how often Apple TV was mentioned as a courtroom device. Can you imagine? So what are they doing? You go into the courtroom, you don't know what kind of technology to expect, so you're trying to get some kind of control. So Apple TV is one way they've got that. So in a network like this, we know it doesn't work. Law schools have trouble using it. So sometimes they'll set up their own private network. They'll use a hotspot or they'll use their computer. They want to have as much control as possible, and Apple TV is one tool in their I've got complete control over my presentations toolbox. So Apple TV combined with other things helps them a lot. Or they may even do things like, all right, so here has an iPhone. Well, here's a really nice case for their iPhone. Whose case has a projector built in? So there's that option as well. So they're really sort of into how far they can push this. And these are the kinds of tips that come out during the presentations. Like, wow, I never imagined lawyers will figure out ways to make the technology work for them. They look for the problem. I need to be able to control how I present in the courtroom, and they find technological solutions. Okay, my iPhone is my projector.
And people are mentioning the very envious responses they got from opposing counsel when they walk in there with that whole setup. People are like, oh, can I get on your network? No, I'm sorry, you're not on my private domain.
So, you can also screw over your opposition. They're always looking for solutions for their office. They're still very excited over the 2-monitor solution.
I am too.
Yes, I'm excited about 2-monitor. Yes.
I'm really excited about the new OS 10.
Oh, yeah, the new improvements are OS 10 to get us to have better control of our monitors. Someone have a question or a point?
No, I just love my 2 monitors.
I love my 2 monitors. Sometimes there are 3 monitors, sometimes
But besides things, basic, hardware setups and things like this at your desk, we also saw things. I went to a session on voice recognition, and obviously the major player in that is drag and dictate. And a lot of people enjoy specific things that they needed. But they pointed out that you have voice recognition, speech recognition tools built into your domain or into your operating systems now, both for Macs and for Windows. If you have Windows 7 or above, you have voice recognition built into your computer. So there are things like that people are like, oh, I had no idea I could just do things. So a lot of tips like that aren't necessarily go out and buy something, but just play with your operating system. You never know what's in there, and I'll talk some more about that for Macs.
What about Android and Chrome OS?
There was some stuff about Android, but lawyers, because the ABA Tech Show, were very focused on iOS. Though at one point there was sort of iOS versus Android versus Windows Mobile, and people were voting online and Android won, but it seemed that those votes were rigged by some really, really rabid Android fans. So there is some love for Android, but a lot of things did focus. Now, a lot of the stuff is available for the Android, but obviously Apple TV and things like that are not, that have different solutions.
They had a whole track for Mac users. I didn't see anything like that for Android.
Maybe next year, and this can be proposed as well. They seem to be very flexible and welcoming of new introductions of new technologies and solutions. One of the most popular sessions is the 60 sites in 60 minutes session where they bring up different sites. One of my favorite sites from that one is Mondo. Is anyone familiar with that? So if you go to a lot of your travel price sites, they are usually owned by airplanes or airline companies or hotels. This one is independent. They brought up another example too, so you can get a more variety of prices, a bigger variety of prices and options. So a lot of the sites were focused on really practical solutions to practical problems. Another one of my favorites they mentioned is called TaskRabbit. Is anyone familiar with that? Anyone use TaskRabbit? TaskRabbit runs errands for you. So if you're super busy, you can send out a TaskRabbit person to pick up your dry cleaning or do your grocery shopping, depending on what city you're in.
Basically, it takes advantage of people who have a lot of time on their hands, maybe they're underemployed or something like that, or they have a flexible schedule and they're willing to do stuff for people, so kind of a micro hire site.
Right. So most of the 60 sites are focused on solutions to problems. Some were not. For some reason, FARC got mentioned as a site this year. Does anyone know FARC? Yeah, okay, so it's one of those like link, every few minutes type site of somewhat dubious humor. Don't read the comments. And risky roads was another one that I like that I mentioned, where you could figure out what the riskiest roads around you are, which is particularly if anyone's driving around the Chicago area, wants to know what the riskiest roads are. And we will be posting a link to the 60 sites so you can see these.
I want to sort of start on some of the content of some of the sessions I went to, and if I could go off script for just a moment. One of the great things with these sessions is that, especially for in legal ed, for the most part, these sessions are done by practitioners in the field. So you are really getting the perspective of lawyers on the ground, and I think that's great to be able to take back to your institutions, because you can tell students, and you're not just saying, you need to learn this. You can say, well, I just heard from this partner at this major firm saying, you need to learn this. So you can kind of stand on those shoulders. And in addition, if you go to these sessions, going to the tech show, there are a million sessions, and you're not going to be able to make it to all of them. The material, the educational materials they provide are fantastic. You get a USB stick with a million PDFs. I probably have a couple hundred pages worth of materials of all the session content, so it's really valuable stuff. But anyway, getting into the some of the stuff I was interested in, they had a couple sessions on Windows 8. And interestingly, the ABA does an annual legal technology survey, and they had some preliminary results available. And they said it was interesting because early indications were that Windows 8 adoption actually was looking more like Windows 7 adoption than Windows Vista adoptions. It was 7% right now using Windows 8. And this suggests, at this point, that lawyers are actually adopting Windows 8 at a much brisker pace than the world at large. So that little sort of factoid out there. Some of the cool things that maybe you guys already know about Windows 8, but some of the presenters were really keen on, were the features. One, have any of you heard of the Windows to Go feature in Windows 8 Enterprise? A couple of you. Really cool feature. Basically, you can essentially clone your whole Windows profile onto a USB stick and take that anywhere with you, pop it into any other, Windows 7 or Windows 8 computer, and bring up your whole desktop, apps and all. It's basically a portable workspace. You can bring it with you anywhere. And the other thing with Windows 8 they were keen on was sort of the whole shared ecosystem, that you can jump from your PC to tablet to your phone if you're all operating in the Windows system. And also just they were sort of providing some pro tips for you navigating the new Windows UI, the tiles to search, it's much easier to sort of split screen among different things. And, as I didn't mention this at the tech show because it was just recently announced, but the start button is coming back into Windows 8 with the 8.1 release. And that there was, you have a lot of options for sort of your inputs, not only your mouse, but your touch screen, pen, and also the Leap Motion, which is coming out, I believe, in July, which is a little box that will sit on your desktop that you can use sort of motion, almost like a Kinect, if you've seen the Kinect for Xbox, that you can kind of do one of these things and, basically gesture.
Mine arrives on July 22nd. Can't wait.
Yes. The other thing that perhaps why lawyers were keen on Windows 8 as well is there are some increased security features, that there's a new, and I don't even pretend to understand all what this means, but there's a new secure boot feature, because they get rid of the BIOS or something. It's a new UEFI, which some of you probably understand better than I, but also BitLocker encryption for files as well. So that was some of the highlights when they were talking about Windows 8.
I sat in on some of the Windows 8 sessions myself as well, and it was interesting to see, just because it's so new, that even the experts that were up there talking about how much they loved it were saying, people were asking questions, and they're like, oh, don't know. And then there were enough people in the audience who were using it that they were coming up with answers during the session, and people were like, oh, I never thought to look there. So there's, obviously, it's a very big user interface change, but I think in general there was a lot of enthusiasm, which I can't say that there's usually that when you talk about Windows interface changes. When it came to the Mac track, the sessions that I went to, they had more advanced ones for people who were doing a lot more programming that level, but they also had an intro one that I went to that was talking about, again, kind of taking advantage of the built-in features of your OS, so it didn't talk about any kind of programs to install, it was only built-in features. And I have more of these notes on there, but basic things like keyboard shortcuts. I transitioned to using a Mac as my laptop a few years ago, and I can say that was probably one of the more challenging things. I grew up with Windows and know all of my keyboard shortcuts, so things like, where is my print screen, stuff like that was kind of a hassle at first. But they gave a lot of good resources for that. Things that would be more intimidating for a lot of people, things like getting into the terminal, which is the command line for Mac. They gave a lot of actually pretty helpful tips talking about how you can pull up the manual, for example, so that you can learn how to do things really quickly. So there were two guys giving that presentation. One of them is a pretty common blogger and podcaster, and the other guy is actually hired by a lot of firms that do use Mac to go in and write scripts for them. So some of the things he was explaining were how to use Automator and how to use Terminal, and he was talking about learning to script for Mac, because there's a manual built in for every command. So if you are going to try to learn how to do things, and there are a few basic things like how to print out the list of every document that's in a folder. Well, I went back and did that immediately. I have a lot of projects where that would be really helpful. I'm trying to remember. I just misspelled his name when I was searching for it and had to figure it out.
Sparky?
No, Larry Stratton, I think, is the one who does a lot of programming for firms. They also talked about, oh yeah, Sparky was the other guy though. They talked about using Preview. And some of these are just little tips that I was like, I am going to use that every day. Did you know, for instance, that when you do a screenshot or you open up a JPEG file, you can use something called, oh, I took it off, my notes, but you can turn things into transparent images. You need to get rid of the background by dragging and dropping. So stuff like that, they're just little tweaks. Or you can use the webcam to take a picture of your signature and then remove the background, and then you have a digital signature you can use in all your PDFs from Preview. So little things that people are using all the time. There are built-in dictionaries, Wikipedia Thesaurus, that you can customize your search settings so that you can search for that. You can add foreign dictionaries, so that could be really useful if somebody's doing a lot of work on an international level. They have that built into their computer rather than having to go to a website or go to a book. They showed a lot of tips and tricks for things like mail program and appointments. Larry Staton, I think, I put it down as station and that was wrong, Staton, also put up a bunch of stuff on his GitHub of automated tools that you can download and use with Automator. So those were kind of macros that you could use to do things like create a folder tree for every single case. So every time you get a new client, you need to gather certain types of information. He would write these scripts, people could download them and run them. So obviously people are really taking Mac kind of to another level.
And we can put the stuff, we will have a lot of information about this in on the session website. So again, links to Mac Sparky, links to GitHub, that kind of thing. So next.
I know there's already been a session on this here at Cali, but I was very interested in going to 2 different sessions on digital evidence. I went to one on social media, and I went to another one on mobile tech. And of course, these are also very much in the news right now. The social media one I found actually really, really creepy. And it's not because I don't know what's possible. We have faculty here who are doing a lot of great research and talking about this. Richard Warner and Lori Andrews. Lori Andrews just wrote a book on privacy law and social networking and things like that. But what I found creepy was that they were really pushing, even in excess of what they saw as like the legal interpretation, both on the part of the social networks and judges, to get more than anybody says is reasonable. They're like, oh, we know everybody's gonna tell you shouldn't do this, get it, because it's awesome. You get everybody's information. And they're like, so basically their only advice was, try not to get caught and don't be creepy in public because it'll work against you. They were saying things like follow all your jurors on Twitter, but don't do it in the courtroom, because that would rule out the people who voted for so-and-so, because they're following political leaders. I don't agree. Yeah. And they were complaining about all these privacy policies that are based on outdated laws that were written before the internet.
So they don't like privacy.
No, it was really, and I would think that at least even if you're in a civil case, some people are gonna wanna protect their client's privacy, and not just go after the other person, and they didn't really give any advice on that in the session, which was interesting. They did give some interesting tips. For instance, it's very easy to prove if somebody has a social media profile on something like Facebook by putting their email in without a password. And then even if they've changed their name so you can't search for them, if it comes up with a profile, it says that you put in the wrong password, you left it blank, then you know they have a profile. Then you can go to the judge and get everything they've ever put in there. So basically it's just discovery trumps privacy over and over. So, yeah. The next one. On the other hand, I actually found the mobile law one a lot more easy to take. They emphasized quite a bit that this is something you really want to outsource. This is not something that you want to try to figure out yourself. If you're in a divorce case, if you're in a business litigation case where somebody has evidence that's on your phone, it's very complex. You don't know what the device is, all kinds of different types of information. It could be, it could be their actual call logs. It could be GPS information. It could be images that are stored on there. Let me see, GPS information, browser history, caller ID, stuff like that. And it's very complex and hard to do because it depends on their carrier, it depends on their phone model. But they have outside firms that will do this for you. And what they really advocate is if you're in a case where you think this is going to be evidence, you send it off to the firm, they use their software, they pull all the stuff off, and then they put it in a black box where they don't touch it. And that way you can send the device back and the other person doesn't even necessarily know that you have all that content. But they set it aside until the judge or whatever counsel they get in the case says, no, this is now evidence, and then the outside firm can share with both parties so that you can be sure that it's authenticated properly, that you don't have fingerprints on it that invalidate your evidence if that's necessary. And they really emphasize know who has rights to the information so that you don't end up getting in more trouble for taking people's private information. And I also thought it was interesting that they talked quite a bit about different telecom companies storing different levels of information. Some of them, and this is something that as a librarian, of course, when the FBI started asking for people's library records years ago, the ABA and others just decided to be a good policy not to store that information. That's kind of what's happened with a lot of the telephone companies as well. They'll store call logs, but they don't store as much content as maybe they could.
Clearly not Verizon.
Or what I guess they're doing is they have their storage and then picks up, my understanding is that it gets picked up by the NSA.
Yeah, and actually that's part of the whole PRISM, and the other things is the government took on some of that storage because the companies didn't want to because it'd be too much headache for them. So it was really interesting reading a lot of those recent news stories in light of some of these sessions where the people actually do this type of evidence.
I went to a very interesting session on geolocation. It was very technical. It was interesting to sort of see all the different technologies that make geolocation happen. So they talked about the different ways that people can be geolocated. Your IP address can provide some location information, for example. Systems that are tied into the GPS satellite system can provide some information. Your phone can, in triangulation with cell towers, can provide location. Sometimes all these can be combined to provide different kinds of location information. And it's interesting to see just how much people, how easy it is to geolocate someone just based on their phone. They talk about the difference between geolocation and geotagging. Location is where you are, tag is metadata, and of course your phone is always adding all this kind of metadata onto your phone. And your phone, of course, has a bunch of data into it. There's different IDs. So your phone apparently has 2 MAC addresses just associated with it alone. So if people are trying to figure out different ways to control that. One of the things they did address in this session is different ways that you can turn off the location information in your phone. And I'll share some of that online. But of course, there's only so much information that can be turned off. There's also ways that people can geolocate you and you're not necessarily aware of it. For example, I think some rental cars have geolocation information. They have little kind of electronic fences, and they can tell when you've sort of gone beyond where you're supposed to go. Some people use these kinds of sensors for legitimate reasons. I've got a fleet of taxis and I want to know where they are. Sometimes these get used for privacy-breaking reasons. They mentioned that I guess the FBI is supposed to have a program, though I guess it's not been confirmed, called Stingray. So you can turn all the information off on your phone, but if the FBI has tagged you with a Stingray on your phone, they can still locate you. So that's one of the things they've been talking about. So it's very interesting. Obviously, this is, again, along with the mobile is that Emily mentioned, this is information people can get off of your phone. In this, they were just discussing the different technologies that were available, and to the extent that we can control them ourselves, but it did have far-ranging privacy implications just from one small device. And also, of course, our tablets and our computers.
IP addresses.
Yeah, IP addresses can give away location information too.
Actually, if I can go back to the mobile one for just a second, I forgot to mention at the end, they did a kind of hands-on demonstration showing how spoofing services can also try to mask where information is coming from. And they talked about some legitimate uses for this. There are companies that offer things where you call in the caller ID shows a different number. And that's, if you just looked at the phone, you wouldn't be able to tell that they were using a spoofing service. And so they said a lot of doctors are happy to use this because then they can make calls to clients from their personal cell phones if they need to. And they always get the office number on the client side. So that's not super creepy or anything. But then they said, on the other hand, this has been used in a lot of domestic abuse situations where somebody has, an anti-stalking rule that they're never supposed to contact this person, then they'll use the spoofing service and they'll make all the calls at weird times and they can't block it because they can choose whatever number they want. Especially if they know everybody's contacts, so they can make it look like your mother's calling or something. It was interesting because the same company that offers that service also provides the anti-spoofing. But you have to pay for it, so that would really suck if you were the person being stalked, because then whoever it is that's contacting you, you have to pay to get rid of them. But the same tools to log in and unlock it are available. Going forward, the keynote was from David Kogan. That was very well received. He was very funny. I mean, any of you that follow him on New York Times or Twitter know how entertaining he can be. And I think this is one of the larger themes of the conference and of this conference as well. It's just disruption and how tech disrupts everything that you're doing. He talked about all of the advances in how we maybe haven't gotten the right frameworks for what technology we have, that we live in the future right now, that our phones, smartphones, for example, are not just phones, that they're also, compasses. And he used an example of a couple apps that let people play music as if they're in like Zelda or something, whatever that's called. And
it becomes an instrument.
yeah, it becomes an instrument. Your phone becomes an instrument. And then you can listen to people anywhere in the world. And these are just kind of things that we could never have imagined. So the pace of change is really, really fast. But then he also gave the example, sometimes it's completely uneven. How many people had to listen to, when you call a voicemail, wait for a beep. And you're getting this, would you like to send a fax or something like this? And he talked about a campaign that he kind of run to get rid of the beeps. But on the other hand, so we're still adjusting to the pace of change in technology, but this pace is changing us. And so he talked about factors that he's seeing more and more, especially, these are kind of generational, but they affect anybody who's a heavy user of technology. The factor of ego, that social media and everything like this has made us always broadcasting all about ourselves. Instant access to everything. I think this is especially true when you think about media and how many people have a VCR, Obviously, a lot of people have things like TiVo. That was a hardware thing. But now, if you don't have access to the channel, you can find out how to stream it illegally. And this is just more and more that kind of impatience is affecting our users too, because they come into the library or as a student or something like this, and if you tell them, oh, we're recording it, we'll have it ready for you in a week, and it's gonna be on this device that you have to go play somewhere else. They're just gonna give up if they don't get instant access to everything. And just completely different standards for privacy, obviously. Once we're used to broadcasting ourselves all the time, I mean, all of you have probably heard something about these major news stories about prison and things like this, and how much outrage you really see. Sometimes you see a lot from specific people, but you hear a lot of, yeah, who expects privacy anymore from a lot of users, and that's, so he said, we need to learn to enjoy the advances, and a lot of times this does come from checking out what the younger generations, the people who aren't changing their frameworks, but are just growing up with these frameworks and see what they're doing. But we also need to learn to teach the intangibles, the things that maybe this generation is not learning because they've always taken these things for granted. So things like ethics in terms of social media. You know, you see all of this huge controversy about bullying and people's boundaries in the sense of no consequences for their actions a lot of times when it's, you know, through technology. And also the idea of permanence is something that, especially if you're dealing with younger people, it's just always going to be less on their radar because they don't have that much life experience with it. But those are things that older generations especially bring to technology that you can own that. You don't need to be thinking that you're just slow at everything. We go on to the next track. They did have a whole track on collaboration, and I went to 2 sessions, and I'll talk about 3 specific examples. One of them was a virtual law firm. Elizabeth already mentioned Clio, and they mentioned how much they use that. Over and over, when we talked about things like this, they did talk a lot about some very specific tech tools, and so on my notes I have all the specific things that they're using in this virtual law firm, and in one of my other examples as well. But more than that, they said you have to build a culture of collaboration. If you don't have that sense, and that's not necessarily something that students are learning in school, because it's a very competitive, individualistic structure for legal education, and it has been that way in a lot of firms as well. But going forward, if they're going to do something like a virtual law firm, where they're dealing with services through a lot of kind of web-mediated, people are coming to them through their website, asking for specific things, and they're farming it out. If they don't see each other face-to-face, and they're being hyper-competitive, it's just going to break down communication, it's going to break down their project management and everything else. So they also talked about not only do the staff really have to be integrated and willing to work with this new model of professionalism, but the tools have to be integrated because you don't want to be entering the same data in 5 different systems, especially if you're trying to do things remotely. So Clio, for instance, is a practice management tool, but it integrates with Google Apps and integrates with Box.com is the tool that they were using for sharing documents. And so that type of interoperability and engagement was really important. They outsource a lot of tasks, so they needed to have a way of sharing the documents with the people who were doing kind of their administrative tasks or opposing counsel and things like that. So there are a lot of security and privacy concerns, and there are legitimate reasons why you don't always want to have everything locked up. So they had to plan for that. The other example in that collaboration track was the clerk for the Southern District of Alabama, and he emphasized getting your infrastructure set up so that it would all talk to each other, and they got Mac really early, and he was really proud of that because the judges were able to start using iPhones and iPads right away and have all these things talk to each other. They use Evernote, and they use it with an SMB program so that they can have it on their own network and rather than on the Evernote network. So there may be advanced uses for some of these apps that everybody's been using on a personal level that can really be used across it. He said that the Southern District of Alabama is not where people would stereotype really advanced tech use among judges, but they have reduced their support staff quite a bit. The judges are able to, what did he say, have access to their content anywhere. They can review, edit, and respond to updates while they're out hunting. So there were judges who said that there were lawyers turning things in, you know, kind of the end of the day on Friday, assuming that would give them a few more days to get stuff back. And the judge was out there in the field somewhere, looking at his document on his phone, going, I don't think so, and sending it back to him in 10 minutes. So that was pretty interesting. I also went to a section on mobile collaboration and saw the same themes, that it really is about culture more than tech. You have to be based on your context, not your tools. Enthusiasm about tools is great, but you need to get buy-in, so if only one person really loves it, that's never going to go anywhere. And you really need to reduce those silos, so that interoperability between people and also your tech tools is key. And they also emphasized, and I thought this was a really good tip, if you're gonna try to build things like this, know all the frustrations yourself. You'll know what solutions to look for, and you'll also be a much more empathetic teacher.
Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about Let's Think. And what Let's Think is actually a separate program from the AV Tech Show. It's kind of done in conjunction the night before. It was used to be referred to as Ignite Law, if anyone's heard of Ignite Talks. Kind of TED Talks in a way, but basically it's an hour-long hour and a half long program where it's 10 speakers. They each have 5 minutes each, and it's all around a central theme. And this year's theme was disruption. And so really, first thing I want to mention about Let's Think is if you are in Chicago at this point, when they do this, if you're there for the tech show or you're just in Chicago, go to Let's Think. They do have, it's free tickets, and even if you don't manage to get a ticket, I would show up, because this year there was plenty of people that had tickets that didn't show up, and they were just letting people in the room, so it's at the hotel where they do the tech show. So go, it's really great. These speakers, because it's very, when you only have 5 minutes, you've really got to fine tune your message. And so there's good stuff. And I just want to highlight some of the sort of overarching themes and some of the points that were made around the theme of disruption. Virtual law practice got brought up by a couple speakers, and they made an interesting point that the primary driver of disruption for many industries is a change in the delivery method of a commodity. We see that with movies, entertainment, We don't go to Blockbuster anymore, we get them online. And that's happening with law practice. You don't necessarily have to go to a law office. You can Skype with your lawyer and do document exchanges over, a secure document, email system. And they said, but keep in mind, virtual law practice is not a solution. It's not a panacea for out-of-work lawyers, new grads that need a job. Because it's still a lot of core legal skills that you need, networking with clients and so on. And then another thing is, right now virtual law practice is very segmented in a way that they only handle slices of things. It's not a full service practice. And they're saying this is sort of the next disruption for law practice. It's going to come from when virtual law firms go to, become more full service virtual law firms. Next, under the sort of another theme there was a lot of talk about AI, analytics, sort of those things. And they said artificial intelligence, some of the things that been mentioned already. They said, that technology, it's really the best and sometimes the only solution for discovering the sort of the unknowns or the black swans in litigation. But they also said some of the darker side of this, the darker side of analytics and this data crunching, is it's only as good as the data you have that you're putting in the system. And then, sort of on a lighter note, there was a speaker who talked about sort of an ongoing theme in the legal world is sort of just the personal satisfaction of lawyers working in law. And you hear a lot about unhappy lawyers. And one of the speakers had a very funny introduction of saying, we really need to stop telling kids that, how would you be a good lawyer? Because really, when you say you'd make a great lawyer, it's a polite way of saying you're really annoying. So, but they said, the solution, one of the solutions to unhappy lawyers is to find what you're really good at and do it. I mean, they talk about a lawyer that he loved ham radio and sort of that, that enthusiast stuff. And he became basically the expert in FCC and radio and does all this kind of stuff and made a really booming, robust law practice around this area. And he said, there's 5 P's for an outstanding lawyer: passion, potential, people, and then charge a premium and pursue it. And lastly, some closing thoughts about Let's Think and some of the things that were mentioned is that disruption can be a beautiful thing as long as you're on the right side of it. And then a lot of talk about LegalZoom and those up-and-comers that are infringing on lawyers, sort of livelihoods. And they said, the progeny of LegalZoom is possibly Skynet Legal, and which will become self-aware in 2026. So be aware. And lastly, one of the speakers for Let's Think who couldn't make it because she was sick was Cali's own Sarah Glassmeyer, but one of the moderator of Let's Think was so impressed with her slide deck, he had to share one of her slides, even though she wasn't there. And the slide was a quote, a famous quote by the author Neil Gaiman, and I think it's very appropriate here, that was, "Don't fuck with librarians." So, can all get behind that.
We'll send you to the Matrix. So one of the best things about going to the ABA Tech Show is you get to talk about some of the really high-tech things, and one of the high-tech things that came up was predictive coding. Is anyone familiar with predictive coding? Can you explain it? This is sort of on the high end because one of those things that is done for really big cases with really big money. Why? Because predictive coding is what's being used now. When you have a case with 100,000 documents or more, and you need a way to quickly figure out which documents are responsive, relevant, or not responsive. And traditionally this was done by baby lawyers, and they would look at document after document after document. But this is expensive, and it turns out studies have found not that efficient. So they are creating programs that can go through these documents and determine which are which. And it turns out that this is actually going to require a good bit of not just programming expertise, but legal expertise, because something has to tell the program what's responsive or not responsive. So that's the first part. Then the other thing that's going to require legal expertise is you can't just say this is responsive, not responsive, and send 100,000 documents through and expect the results. You have to drag and dictate, you have to do training. So lawyers are also needed to make sure that as they do the training with maybe 1,500 documents, that they're getting good responses and that it's consistent. So maybe 5 experts who have an idea of what to expect out of the big document class can look at the 1,500 documents and say, yes, this is responsive, we agree, we can go ahead. Because now you can do this for 100,000, 200, 1 million documents just based on the 1,500 and get good results. So it's kind of interesting to see how this technology is getting that smart. And I'm wondering if eventually it's going to be used for smaller document sets, because often technology that starts out big and expensive and used for expensive cases then can apply to smaller cases and to smaller law firms later. Right now, this is not that expensive. It's not being used that much. Some courts have addressed it. One court mandated it, even though neither party asked for it. But it's something to keep an eye on. All right, so in closing, what does this mean for law schools? And I think you saw some things in the vendor area that you thought really had some good law school applications.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, things that we, sort of what's the takeaway? How can we use this in law schools? And I think, I've mentioned a few, there's sort of some of the obvious things, clinics, law practice management classes, trial act classes, though bringing that in. But there's a lot of other ways you can bring this in, especially, just like I was at some other session where they were joking that a law student graduated and didn't know the difference between a statute and a reg. I think it's just as appropriate that law students know what, a law practice management software looks like before they graduate. So they aren't, when they're being asked at their firm, oh, put, this, log your work here, put your work here, that they're not sitting there clueless. So some of the other things you can do, beyond just sort of an actual class is, think about doing like a cool tools, like a show and tell. Bring some of this stuff in, have a lunchtime workshop on some of this stuff. Or, I know a lot of you do legal research boot camps or prepare to practice boot camps. What about like a legal technology boot camp or legal tech prepare to practice workshop series or one-day thing? Some specific ideas, I know of some law schools that use law practice management software in their library for managing faculty research projects, if they have RAs that they're trying to manage and parse out projects. Any kind of drafting or skills courses, you can use some of these document creation software. Timeline software, I think this can be used in any class. Skills, substantive. How many of you have encountered, a really tangly legal scenario that you're trying to make clear for students? Wouldn't a timeline be a lot easier, a visual sort of explanation of what went down when? So those are some examples. I mentioned like WordBreak, in a writing class, some of these teleconferencing, Google Hangout-esque products for maybe doing online office hours or meetings. e-discovery software and simulations or classes. So that's, that's just a couple of very specific examples, so.
I was going to add to that. There's an idea, I think, that, we can't show our students how to use these particular case management systems because in their workplace they'll have a different case management system. And the thing is, I think they need to know, as we're saying, what is a case management system and what it does. If you think this doesn't make a difference, did anyone read the article, for some reason it flared up recently, where the Kia was hiring law firms, and they said, okay, if we're going to hire you, we want to make sure that you're not wasting time on stupid technical issues. So they tested 9 law firms. 9 law firms failed on just getting basic things like putting PDFs in a document, searching spreadsheets. And it's not that the lawyers involved didn't know how to use Excel, it's they just didn't know what a spreadsheet program did. So just making sure that our students, along with basic information literacy, can they identify the difference between a statute and a reg. They have technical literacy too.
And I think this is very much kind of an issue in law schools because of kind of generational expectations. If faculty are from a certain generation, they just assume because most kids have laptops and seem to be capable on Facebook that they know everything there is to know about software and technology. It's not the case. And these are skills that it may be difficult to work it into like learning outcomes in a class, but in the library we're used to talking about things like information literacy, that these are things, overarching skills that we're trying to teach strategies as much as specifics. And I think this is really true about tech, that people need to understand, okay, I have a new software program in front of me, how do I figure it out? How many people in the room know that XKCD tech support flow chart? The one that says, okay, everybody, mom, dad, grandpa, person down the block from me, here's how I do tech support. I look at it, do I understand what it does? Okay, I don't know, I'm gonna go Google the key terms, and then you keep going through the loop until finally, hey, now you're an expert. These are not necessarily really abstract. I mean, that one XKCD cartoon actually kind of sums it all up. But skills like that are not something that every law student is gonna have. There are a lot of law students who are not necessarily super happy about technology, that don't walk in playing with software. Those of us in this room probably do have that approach. Maybe we grew up playing computer games, maybe we didn't, but we still probably have that, the computer's not gonna kill me, I can figure it out, I'm gonna just poke around until I get it working approach to things, and not everybody does, and that's definitely not just a generational thing. There are other things in terms of business literacy, and I think that's something that Elizabeth and Debbie really picked up on, but also social literacy. As Elizabeth was mentioning, is definitely something, if you're doing a virtual firm, it takes a different level of connection with people to build those client lists, to connect with the other people that you don't see on a regular basis. And there are issues with people, I mean, that was something that David Pogue was bringing up, when you always have your phone in your face, how good are you gonna be in face-to-face interviews? And that might not be something that you can do in a class, but maybe that's something you need to incorporate into your career services, practice sessions, things like that. Which one of you is taking on from here?
We can kind of wrap up with
Sure,
some
yeah.
questions, so.
Yeah, it's important that students understand that business is a law is a business, and as Bill Henderson mentioned today, there's a lot of jobs out there for students to have that they don't necessarily think like, oh yeah, I could be a lawyer, or you could work for one of the many vendors that we saw. And again, this is part of our education for the students in class and part of our services, to know that there is this whole business, and we can send students there. It's pretty cheap for them, and we've encouraged them to go and learn more about just the whole idea of like what technology means to the law along with technology and how it works together. And I think this is something that we can do a more thorough job of integrating within our law schools. But we want to know if you have any questions, or if there's any things that you guys have tried or you've seen at something like the Tech Show.
Yeah, it seems like there's so many just amazing new technologies that attorneys have access to now. And I was just wondering how you guys in particular, if there's any specific way that you've attempted to introduce these technologies to the professors or the students at your schools. Tips on how to do that and how to get the faculty to adopt them in, say, like a law skills class, or, and I mean, because, Cali's about legal instruction, and the ABA Tech Conference, we're trying to get those things together and bring them back to our faculty and students.
If I can repeat your question so it goes onto a recording, and hopefully I
Yeah.
get this right.
Sorry, I'm a little
You put a lot of
soft-spoken,
detail
yeah.
into it, no, that's fine. It needs to be on the microphone to be
Okay.
recorded. You're asking, we went to the ABA Tech Show, we saw a lot of tools, there's a lot of great stuff. How do we bring this back to the faculty? How would we get this into the classes? How do we bridge that gap between the law students and the practice? Because that's what the ABA Tech Show is, it's for practitioners. Well, one way would honestly be to send more students to something like this, to build demand. Because it's great if the faculty can see some way that they can work this into their syllabus. And Debbie always does brown bags right after something like this to talk about it, and they're very well attended. But I do think that you need student demand as well.
Right, in some places, because I know Ken, sitting in the middle, teaches a course on just this kind of technology. And so there are some schools that have integrated that within their curriculum as a technology. One of the things we're trying to do, particularly with legal research, and I'd like to see this do this with legal technology too, is integrate these skills into other kinds of classes. So if you teach it as a standalone, sometimes you don't get the right students taking it because they'll miss information they need, or sometimes it just doesn't make any sense because it's all by itself. So the more we can figure out ways to integrate what we've seen here into classes, I think the better our students will learn that.
And one other thought is maybe try to go after the low-hanging fruit first. And by that I mean, who's already using this in your law school? Maybe some of your adjunct professors. If they're practicing, they're maybe already using this, and talk to them and say, hey, do you want to maybe bring this in somehow? And they might even not even think that it's a possibility, but maybe raise it with them first, because they might be more familiar and more interested or willing to try it.
One more question?
Or you're like, snacks.
Or snacks? Snacks!
One more sugar.
Oh, wait, Ken.
I have a question, but for you that you pass on when you put your things up. You will find in the twin course that I gave you access to early in the semester here, and I can take it out for you on back home. There's a very well-written blog from an attorney, his name unfortunately is escaping me at the moment, who practices extensively in e-discovery and does an excellent recitation